Beneath the desert sun, at the edge of the Giza plateau, a single form endures, without introduction. It does not announce a year. It carries no name chiseled into its flank, no dedication carved at its feet. It simply remains cut from the living rock, facing the horizon where light arrives each morning. The Sphinx does not tell us when it began. It asks us how time should be read when the record is incomplete. For centuries, observers have approached it with an assumption so familiar it often goes unspoken, that age must be anchored to a moment of creation, a birthday, a reign, a date that can be written down and agreed upon. But the Sphinx resists that habit. There is no inscription to consult, no foundation deposit to uncover. What survives instead is stone, landscape, and a long accumulation of changes, some slow, some abrupt, layered one upon another. In this setting, the question, how old is it, becomes less straightforward than it sounds. What we do know appears modest at first. The monument stands on the eastern edge of the plateau, oriented toward the rising sun. Its body and the enclosure around it were carved directly from a limestone ridge, transforming a natural outcrop into a figure that feels inseparable from the ground itself. This choice already complicates the search for a beginning. Built monuments often preserve their own context, layers of fill, foundations, sealed spaces that hold clues. A rock-cut monument removes context as it takes shape. The act of carving is subtractive. What once surrounded the form is carried away. The stone beneath the Sphinx is far older than any human hand that touched it. It formed millions of years before the first settlement along the Nile, yet that geological age is not the age of the sculpture. Conflating the two creates an illusion of certainty where none exists. The stone provides a stage, not a top. To learn anything useful, we must shift our attention from the age of the material to the history of its exposure, when it was carved, when it was buried, when it was revealed again. This is where the monument begins to complicate our expectations. The Sphinx has not existed in a single state. It has been cleared, reburied, repaired, and altered many times. Sand advanced across the plateau, covering the body while leaving the head exposed. Later generations removed that sand, exposing surfaces that had been protected for centuries. Each cycle changed how wind, moisture, and temperature interacted with the stone. Each cycle left marks that overlap rather than align neatly in sequence. The visible surface today is therefore not a simple record of time passing. It is a palimpsest. Some areas appear deeply worn, others remain comparatively sharp. At a glance, this unevenness invites a tempting conclusion. Perhaps different parts belong to different ages, but appearances can mislead. Stone erodes unevenly, even under identical conditions, depending on its internal structure. Exposure matters as much as duration. A surface bared for long periods may look younger than one exposed for a shorter time under harsher conditions. These observations do not answer the question of age. They redefine it. Instead of asking for a number, the monument forces us to ask about processes. What kinds of changes occur when limestone meets wind-driven sand? How does moisture behave in a desert margin where rainfall is rare but not absent? What happens when salts crystallize in tiny fractures, expanding and contracting with daily temperature shifts? None of these processes require dramatic events. They operate quietly, accumulating effects that only become obvious over long spans. The Sphinx sits precisely at the intersection of such processes. It occupies a low point relative to parts of the plateau, encouraging sand to settle around it. When buried, the sand shields the lower body from abrasion, while concentrating moisture at the boundary between buried and exposed stone. When cleared, the newly exposed surfaces face air, wind, and temperature swings. For the first time in generations, the stone records both states, but not their durations. Written history enters a story late. When texts finally speak of the Sphinx, they do so as if encountering something already old. The earliest surviving inscription associated with it describes a monument half lost to sand, already powerful enough to demand reverence. The text does not explain who carved it or why. It assumes presence rather than origin. This framing matters. It tells us that by the time words were set in stone nearby, the Sphinx had already slipped beyond living memory. This absence of a founding narrative has attracted attention for centuries. In a landscape dense with records of royal building projects, the silence surrounding the Sphinx's creation feels conspicuous. Yet silence does not function like a missing piece in a puzzle box. It does not guarantee that something extraordinary has been concealed. Documents decay, stone erodes, contexts vanish. What survives does so unevenly. Recognizing this prevents a different kind of error, mistaking absence for intention. The temptation, when faced with uncertainty, is to rush toward an explanation that restores clarity. Either the monument belongs firmly within a familiar historical framework, or it must be pushed far beyond it. The video you are watching resists that impulse. It treats uncertainty not as a failure, but as a condition that must be managed. Each line of evidence carries limits. Each method answers some questions while leaving others untouched. Geology can describe how stone responds to environment, but but it cannot name a builder. Archaeology can map relationships between structures, but it cannot always identify the moment a tool first struck rock. Texts can preserve names and intentions, but only when they survive in the right places. Conservation records show how modern decisions altered ancient surfaces, reminding us that even the present shapes how the past is read. The Sphinx stands at the convergence of these constraints. It is not mute, but it does not speak the language of dates. It offers instead a series of clues that must be weighed against one another, not stacked into a single conclusion. To approach its age responsibly, we must accept a slower pace. We must allow the evidence to accumulate quietly, even when it refuses to align into a single number. In this sense, the monument teaches a lesson before it reveals a mystery. Time is not always a point on a line. Sometimes it is a range defined by boundaries by what can be shown to have happened before and what must have happened after. Between those boundaries lies a corridor of possibility shaped by stone, sand, and memory. The Sphinx occupies that corridor. It does not invite us to solve it quickly. It invites us to learn how to read it at all. Long before the first chisel touched the plateau, the stone beneath the Sphinx already carried a history measured in deep time. Layer upon layer of limestone had settled at the bottom of an ancient sea, compacted slowly into beds of differing hardness and texture. Fossils embedded within those layers speak of marine life that vanished millions of years before humans ever appeared along the Nile. This fact is often stated quickly, then misunderstood just as quickly. The age of the stone is not the age of the monument. Confusing the two collapses geological time and human history into a single blur, creating a false sense of precision. To understand why that distinction matters, it helps to consider how humans usually date the past. We are comfortable with artifacts that come from sealed layers, from contexts that trap time the way amber traps an insect. A pot buried beneath a floor, a tool sealed in a tomb, these objects carry with them a relative position in a sequence. The Sphinx does not. It was not placed into the earth. It was pulled out of it. The surrounding rock was removed, leaving the figure behind. Whatever traces once lay around it were carried away with the spoil. This subtractive act breaks a habit of thinking that archaeology often relies on. There is no foundation trench to excavate, no fill to analyze beneath the monument. The ground beneath the Sphinx is the same ground that once formed its sides. That continuity makes the monument feel timeless, but it also deprives us of the kinds of markers that usually anchor chronology. What remains is the relationship between carved surfaces and the landscape around them. That relationship reveals an important tension. The limestone ridge existed long before dynastic Egypt, but the decision to shape it into a colossal figure could only have occurred once people possessed the tools, labor organization, and cultural motivation to do so. Geological age sets the stage. It does not write the script. The moment of carving belongs to human time, even if that moment cannot be isolated precisely. This distinction becomes critical when erosion enters the discussion. Limestone does not erode at a uniform rate. Its response depends on internal structure, exposure, and environment. Harder beds resist, softer beds recede. A single monument carved across multiple layers will age unevenly from the start. This is not an anomaly, it is expected. When observers notice that parts of the Sphinx appear more degraded than others, they often assume unequal ages. But unequal resistance can produce the same visual outcome without invoking different carving periods. Exposure history complicates the picture further. The surface that has been buried under sand for centuries may look younger than one exposed continuously, even if both were carved at the same time. Sand acts as a shield against wind abrasion, but it also traps moisture and salts at its boundary. When conditions shift and the sand is removed, decay can accelerate abruptly. The stone records these changes, but not their timing. Understanding this requires patience with process. Limestone interacts with water in more ways than rain alone. Dew forms at night. Humidity fluctuates. Groundwater rises through capillary action, carrying dissolved salts that crystallize as water evaporates. Each cycle exerts pressure on the stone's pores. None of this demands a lush climate. It requires repetition. Over long spans, small effects accumulate into visible change. This is where discussions of ancient climate often enter, sometimes with more certainty than the evidence allows. It is true that North Africa experienced wetter phases during the early Holocene. Grasslands extended farther north. Seasonal rains were more frequent than today, but these shifts were gradual and uneven. They did not transform Giza into a rainforest. For a limestone surface, even modest increases in moisture frequency can alter weathering patterns, especially when combined with salts and microfractures already present in the stone. The difficulty lies in translating pattern into duration. Rounded profiles and vertical grooves can form under different conditions through different mechanisms. A channel carved by runoff during rare but intense storms can resemble one formed under more frequent rainfall. Without knowing how long a surface was exposed, and under which specific conditions, erosion becomes descriptive rather than diagnostic. It tells us what happened, not when it began. This is why geology, on its own, cannot deliver a date. It provides constraints. It identifies what processes are plausible and what are not. It can rule out certain claims while leaving others open. When geological observations are stretched beyond these limits, they lose their grounding. The stone does not object, but the method does. Recognizing these boundaries does not weaken the inquiry, it strengthens it. By separating what the stone can say from what it cannot, we avoid mistaking inference from measurement. The Sphinx's limestone body records exposure, protection, decay, and repair. It does not record a calendar. The absence of a geological clock does not imply an absence of structure. It means time must be approached indirectly. This indirect approach aligns with how ancient landscapes often behave. The Giza Plateau was not static. Quarrying reshaped it. Construction altered drainage. Sand advanced and retreated with changes in land use and maintenance. Each intervention modified how natural processes acted on exposed surfaces. Over centuries, these effects intertwined. The present surface is the sum of many histories, not a snapshot of one. When the Sphinx is described as possibly older than dynastic Egypt, the statement often hides an assumption. The visible weathering must correspond to uninterrupted exposure under a single climate regime. Once that assumption is questioned, the certainty dissolves. The same features can emerge from different combinations of time, exposure, and material quality. The range of possibilities narrows, but it does not collapse into a single answer. This is not a retreat into ambiguity, it is an acknowledgement of scale. Geologic time stretches across millions of years. Human construction unfolds over decades or centuries. Environmental processes operate somewhere in between. The Sphinx sits where these scales overlap. Stone formed in deep time was shaped by human hands, then altered by processes that care little for dynasties or reigns. To read its age, we must keep those scales distinct. In doing so, we arrive at a quieter insight. The monument does not demand to be older than Egypt to be remarkable. Its power lies in endurance, not extremity. Whether carved early or late, within a known historical window, it has outlasted the records that might have explained it. Stone before history, history after stone. Between them lies a gap that invites interpretation, but only within limits set by the material itself. There is a quiet paradox at the heart of the Sphinx's survival. The same sand that threatened to erase it also protected it. For much of its history, the monument did not stand fully exposed to the elements. Instead, it slipped in and out of view as wind pushed grains across the plateau, filling the enclosure, then slowly releasing it again when human labor intervened. This rhythm burial clearance reburial has repeated so often that it has become one of the defining forces shaping what we see today. When sand accumulates, it does not behave like a simple blanket. It settles unevenly, compacting at the base of walls and against protruding forms. In the case of the Sphinx, this meant that the lower body and enclosure walls were often buried while the head remained visible. To an observer, the monument appeared smaller, almost emerging from the ground rather than standing upon it. This state could persist for generations. During that time, the buried stone experienced a very different environment from the exposed stone above. Wind-driven sand is one of the most effective abrasive forces in a desert margin. Grains strike exposed surfaces again and again, preferentially wearing down softer limestone beds while leaving harder layers protruding. Where sand remains in motion, abrasion accelerates. Where sand settles and stays, abrasion slows. Burial therefore acts as a shield against this particular form of erosion. The lower body of the Sphinx, when covered, was spared the constant scouring that reshaped exposed quarry faces elsewhere on the plateau. Yet protection comes with a cost. Sand traps moisture. Even in an arid climate, humidity fluctuates, dew forms during cool nights. Groundwater rises subtly through capillary action. When sand covers stone, it creates a microenvironment where moisture lingers longer than it would in open air. Salts dissolve and that moisture migrate into the stone's pores. As the water evaporates, those salts crystallize, expanding and exerting pressure from within. Over time, grains loosen, flakes detach, the surface weakens quietly, without dramatic loss of material. The boundary where buried stone meets open air is especially vulnerable. Here, cycles of wetting and drying concentrate their effects. This boundary shifts as sand levels rise and fall. Over centuries, the same surface may move repeatedly between protection and exposure. Each transition resets the conditions under which decay proceeds. The result is a pattern of weathering that does not correspond neatly to a single duration of exposure. Depth of erosion cannot be read as depth of time. This dynamic frustrates attempts to treat the Sphinx as a static object aging under uniform conditions. It never was. Ancient graffiti, traveler accounts, and early photographs show different states of burial at different moments. Sometimes only the head was visible. At other times, the chest and forepaws emerged. Rarely was the entire body exposed before modern excavations. Each of these states altered how the stone interacted with its environment. Human intervention punctuated these cycles. Clearing sand was not a one-time event. It required organized labor, tools, and sustained attention. When authority and resources were available, the enclosure was cleared. When they were not, sand returned. These episodes were motivated by ritual, politics, or practical access, rather than preservation in the modern sense. The aim was visibility, not long-term material stability. Clearing changed more than appearance. It altered airflow within the enclosure, increasing temperature variation between day and night. It exposed newly revealed stone to wind abrasion for the first time in centuries. It allowed rainwater from rare storms to run along surfaces that had not previously experienced direct runoff. Each clearance marked the beginning of a new phase of interaction between stone and environment. This matters because many observations about erosion were made after such clearances, particularly in the modern period. When geologists and archaeologists examined the enclosure walls in the 20th century, they were often looking at surfaces that had only recently been exposed. Some features interpreted as the result of long-term processes may have developed or accelerated under these new conditions. Without precise records of when each surface was uncovered, distinguishing ancient weathering from recent decay becomes difficult. The temptation is to imagine a simpler past, a monument carved, left exposed, and steadily eroded under one climate until the present. The evidence does not support that image. Instead, it points to a monument whose visibility waxed and waned. Sand did not merely threaten the Sphinx with disappearance. It shaped how time registered on its surface. This realization reframes a common assumption. When erosion looks extensive, it is often taken as proof of extreme age. But erosion intensity depends as much on exposure history as on elapsed time. A surface exposed intermittently under harsh conditions may degrade more than one exposed continuously under gentler ones. The Sphinx's enclosure walls, cut into layered limestone, amplify this effect. Softer beds retreat quickly once exposed. Harder beds stand longer. The resulting profiles appear complex, even chaotic, when read without reference to burial cycles. Understanding this complexity does not require extraordinary events. It requires ordinary processes acting repeatedly. Wind, sand, moisture, salts, and human clearing form a system that produces uneven results. The monument records this system faithfully, but not transparently. It does not label which marks belong to which phase. It offers patterns without time in stumps. This is why attempts to extract a single age from weathering alone tend to overreach. They assume continuity where the record shows an eruption. They treat erosion as cumulative in a linear sense, when in reality it is episodic. Each episode operates under its own conditions, influenced by climate, maintenance, and material quality. The sum of these episodes is visible, but their sequence is blurred. The Sphinx therefore challenges a deeply rooted intuition, that time leaves a straightforward trace. In environments where exposure is constant, that intuition sometimes holds. At Giza, it does not. The plateau's position at the desert margin ensures variability. Sand moves. Humans respond. The monument shifts between concealment and display. Time accumulates unevenly. This unevenness is not a flaw in the evidence. It is the evidence. It tells us that the Sphinx cannot be read like a weathered cliff face, left untouched for millennia. It must be read as a monument whose life history includes long intervals of protection and sudden moments of vulnerability. Any account of its age that ignores this history simplifies the problem at the cost of accuracy. Recognizing the role of sand also tempers more dramatic interpretations. The idea that severe erosion demands a vastly older origin loses force once burial cycles are acknowledged. At the same time, the presence of protection does not erase all uncertainty. It constrains it. It narrows the range of plausible explanations without collapsing them into a single conclusion. The Sphinx survives not because it stood alone against time, but because it was alternately hidden from it. Sand both erased and preserved, threatened and protected. This dual role complicates our reading of the stone, but it also explains how the monument endured long enough to become a problem for historians at all. In the shifting boundary between burial and exposure, time left a record that is rich, layered, and resistant to simple answers. Certain shapes have a way of pulling the imagination forward faster than the evidence can follow. On the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, there are places where the limestone curves inward, where vertical channels run down the surface, where edges appear softened rather than sharply cut. These features are often described in simple terms: rounded, grooved, worn, and just as often linked to a single cause: water, rain, a climate far wetter than today. The logic feels intuitive. Water flows downward. It rounds edges as it leaves channels. If such marks exist, then perhaps they point to an age when rain was frequent and sustained, but intuition is not method. The difficulty begins with the word water itself. It suggests a singular force, when in reality it describes a family of processes that behave very differently. Rainfall is only one of them, and not always the most influential. On limestone, Even small amounts of moisture can have outsized effects if they recur often enough. Dew forms quietly during cool nights. Humidity rises and falls. Groundwater creeps upward through capillary action. Each introduces moisture without the drama of a storm. When water enters limestone, it does not need to rush to leave a trace. Calcium carbonate dissolves slowly, widening pores and microfractures over time. Salts dissolved in that water migrate into those spaces. As the water evaporates, salts crystallize, expanding and contracting with changes in temperature and humidity. Grain by grain, the stone weakens. This process can produce smooth, rounded surfaces that resemble those formed by flowing water, even when runoff is minimal. Vertical channels add another layer of complexity. They do not always form because water pours down a wall uniformly. More often, runoff follows paths of least resistance, existing joints, bedding planes, or microfractures in the rock. Where a crack intersects the surface, water concentrates. Over repeated events, that narrow path deepens. The result is a groove that looks deliberate, as if carved by sustained flow, even though it may have formed through many brief episodes. At Giza, rainfall is rare, but when it occurs, it can be intense. Short-duration storms produce sudden runoff that moves quickly across exposed surfaces before evaporating. Over centuries, these rare events can leave a visible imprint, especially where stone quality is uneven. A single storm does little. Hundreds, spread across millennia, can shape stone in ways that appear continuous when viewed without context. This is where climate history often enters the conversation. Paleoclimate studies indicate that North Africa experienced wetter phases during the early and middle Holocene. Seasonal rains extended farther north than they do today. Vegetation was more widespread. These conditions are well documented through pollen records, lake sediments, and regional geology. What they do not do is map neatly onto specific stone surfaces at Giza. Climate describes regional tendencies, not local exposure histories. Even during wetter phases, Giza remained a desert margin, not a landscape of constant rainfall. Moisture increased, but it did so unevenly and intermittently. For a monument like the Sphinx, this means that water-related weathering could intensify without requiring a radically different environment. The difference lies in frequency, not transformation. More nights with dew, more days with elevated humidity, more storms per century, not per year. The challenge is distinguishing between features formed under these conditions and those formed later through other mechanisms. Wind-driven sand continues to abrade exposed stone. Salt weathering accelerates decay in sheltered areas. Moderate repairs introduce new materials that interact chemically with the original limestone. Each of these can mimic or overprint traces left by water. The surface we see is the sum of all these interactions. This is why geology, when practiced carefully, resists single-cause explanations. Field observations are compared across contexts. Similar limestone formations elsewhere on the plateau show comparable features where exposure histories are known. Rounded profiles appear in natural outcrops, quarry faces, and temple blocks carved from the same beds. Vertical grooves appear where joints and bedding planes guide runoff. These parallels do not erase the role of water. They place it within a broader system. When researchers disagree about what water-related features imply, they are often disagreeing about assumptions rather than observations. One interpretation may assume long, uninterrupted exposure under a wetter climate. Another may assume intermittent exposure under variable conditions. The same features can support different timelines depending on which assumption is adopted. Without independent evidence to fix exposure duration, geology cannot choose between them. This does not mean all interpretations are equally plausible. Some claims require conditions that are inconsistent with what is known about the region. Others stretch erosion rates beyond those observed in comparable settings. Careful analysis narrows the field. It does not eliminate uncertainty. The stone allows us to say that water played a role. It does not allow us to say exactly when that role was most significant. Recognizing this limit changes how the question of age is framed. Instead of asking whether water proves extreme antiquity, we ask what kinds of environmental histories are compatible with the observed forms. The answer is broader than often assumed. Modest increases in moisture frequency, combined with long spans of time and complex exposure cycles, can produce features that appear dramatic when isolated. The Sphinx enclosure, cut into layered limestone, magnifies these effects. Softer beds retreat, creating hollows. Harder beds stand proud, forming ledges where runoff follows a fracture. A groove develops. Where salts accumulate, surfaces round and flake. Each mechanism leaves a trace. Together, they create a surface that resists reduction to a single narrative. This resistance is not an obstacle to understanding. It is a guide. It reminds us that stone does not respond to one variable at a time. It responds to the environment as a whole, filtered through material properties and human intervention. Any attempt to read age directly from shape must therefore pass through method. It must state its assumptions openly and test them against alternatives. When the Sphinx is said to be far older because of water erosion, the claim often bypasses this step. It treats form as a verdict rather than as evidence requiring interpretation. The more cautious approach taken here moves more slowly. It accepts that water has left marks, but it refuses to turn those marks into a clock without justification. In this light, the weathered walls of the enclosure do not shout a date. They whisper about processes. They tell us that the stone has interacted with moisture, wind, and salt over long periods, under changing conditions. They tell us that exposure was not continuous, and that material quality matters. They do not tell us how many years have passed since carving. The allure of a simple answer remains strong. A wetter past feels like a key that unlocks the mystery. But the stone asks us to pause. It offers complexity instead of closure. By listening to that complexity, we gain a more durable understanding, one that survives the temptation to trade method for certainty. The Sphinx's weathered face becomes not a proof of origin, but a record of endurance under shifting conditions. If erosion invites questions about deep time, architecture pulls the Sphinx back toward human history. Stone does not exist in isolation at Giza. It is arranged, aligned, quarried, and reused in ways that reveal intention. Around the Sphinx, the landscape is dense with structured temples, causeways, terraces, tied to a period of intense building activity during the Old Kingdom. These relationships do not speak in dates, but they speak in context, and context carries weight. The most frequently cited connection is practical rather than symbolic. The Sphinx enclosure is not merely a hollow around a statue, it is a quarry. The limestone removed to isolate the figure did not vanish. Much of it appears to have been used nearby, particularly in the construction of the Sphinx Temple and the Valley Temple to the east. These temples are built from massive limestone blocks whose size and bedding match stone exposed in the enclosure walls. Petrographic studies trace similarities in grain size and fossil content, suggesting a shared source. This material link matters because ancient large-scale construction favored efficiency. Quarrying, hauling, and setting blocks required coordination. Moving stone over short distances reduced labor and risk. When blocks extracted from one cut appear immediately in adjacent structures, it implies a shared project horizon. The Sphinx, its enclosure, and the nearby temples read as parts of a single episode of intensive modification of the plateau. The layout reinforces this impression. The Valley Temple sits near the ancient Nile floodplain, positioned to receive materials and participants arriving by river. A causeway extends westward from it toward the pyramid complex traditionally associated with Kafir. The Sphinx lies just north of this axis, carved into the ridge that the causeway skirts for proximity is tight. The southern wall of the enclosure runs close to the causeway, leaving only a narrow strip of bedrock between them. This spatial relationship suggests coordination rather than coincidence. Orientation adds another layer. The temples, causeway, and Sphinx share a general east-west emphasis, adapted to the natural slope of the ridge. The plateau is not flattened to impose an abstract grid. Builders worked with the terrain, adjusting alignments where necessary. The enclosure walls bend and shift where limestone beds change, indicating responsiveness to local conditions during excavation. This adaptability is characteristic of Old Kingdom quarrying and construction practices observed elsewhere at Giza. From an archaeological perspective, these observations form a coherent picture. The Sphinx appears embedded within a 4th dynasty building landscape. The techniques, materials, and spatial logic align with what is known of that period's monumental projects. This does not require poetic interpretation. It rests on logistics. Stone was cut where it was needed, used where it lay, and shaped by methods consistent with the tools of the time. Yet this architectural pull toward the Old Kingdom is not absolute. It operates by association, not by inscription. No block from the Sphinx Temple names the Sphinx. Quarry marks identify work gangs and sequences, but they do not label statues. The causeway passes near the enclosure, but it does not intersect it. The relationships are visible in stone, not written in words. This distinction preserves room for debate. The association answers some questions while leaving others open. It establishes plausibility. It suggests that carving the Sphinx during the peak of Old Kingdom monument building makes sense. It does not prove that carving could not have occurred earlier, nor does it specify exactly when within that period it took place. Archaeology often works within such bounds. It narrows possibilities without collapsing them. This is where misunderstandings arise. When the architectural context is presented as definitive proof, critics respond by pointing to gaps, chief among them the absence of a dedicatory inscription. When the context is dismissed entirely, proponents of earlier dates ignore the practical constraints of large-scale stone working. The more measured approach recognizes the strength and the limits of association. It is compelling, but it is not exhaustive. The Sphinx Temple itself illustrates this balance. Its massive blocks were assembled with care, their faces dressed smoothly on the interior. The plan suggests ritual use, likely connected to solar cult practices. The temple's relationship to the Sphinx implies that the statue already existed, or was at least envisioned, when the temple was constructed. But the temple does not tell us whether the Sphinx was carved early in the building program or late, or whether plans evolved as work progressed. Construction projects of this scale were not always linear. Elevation, data, add nuance. The head of the Sphinx sits at a height comparable to certain courses in nearby temples, while the forepaws lie closer to the level of the valley temple floor. These correspondences are approximate, shaped by the slope of the ridge rather than by a strict architectural grid. Subsidence, erosion, and repair have altered these levels slightly over time. What remains is a sense of integration, not precision. This integration strengthens the case for contemporaneity, without erasing uncertainty. The Sphinx belongs to a landscape transformed intensively during the 4th dynasty. Quarry scars, ramps and spoil heaps dot the plateau. Blocks were removed, transported, and set with remarkable organization. In this environment, carving a colossal figure from the ridge fits the pattern of ambition and capability displayed elsewhere. At the same time, archaeology does not grant monopoly to probability. It operates by weighing patterns, not enforcing certainty. Earlier activity at Giza is documented, though less monumental. Later activity is abundant. The Sphinx's placement within the Old Kingdom landscape sets a strong constraint, but it does not function as a timestamp. Understanding this distinction prevents a false choice. Accepting the architectural context does not require dismissing geological questions. Questioning geological interpretations does not require rejecting archaeological ones. Each discipline answers a different aspect of the problem. Architecture tells us where the Sphinx fits within human planning. It does not tell us the exact moment of carving. The power of the architectural argument lies in its ordinariness. It does not rely on lost civilizations or unknown technologies. It relies on stone, moved efficiently, shaped with known tools, and arranged within a coherent plan. Not ordinariness can feel unsatisfying to those seeking dramatic revision. Yet it is precisely what makes the argument durable. It aligns with what is observed repeatedly across the plateau. Still, ordinariness does not equal completeness. The lack of a builder's name lingers. The absence does not negate the context, but it prevents closure. The Sphinx remains tied to a period without being anchored to a line of text. It is present in the architecture without being claimed by it. In this tension between stone and silence, the monument holds its position. Architecture pulls it toward the Old Kingdom, while the absence of explicit documentation keeps the question open. The result is not confusion, but a narrowed corridor of possibility. Within that corridor, the Sphinx stands as part of a human landscape shaped by known practices. Even as its precise moment of creation remains just beyond reach. In a place where stone speaks so often, silence becomes conspicuous. The Giza Plateau is saturated with names. Kings announced themselves in relief and inscription. Overseers carved their titles. Work crews left quarry marks. Administrative records tracked labor, rations, and deliveries with a precision that still surprises modern readers. Against this backdrop, the absence of a text naming the builder of the Sphinx feels less like an oversight and more like a question waiting to be asked. This silence has been noted repeatedly, and just as often misunderstood. It is tempting to treat it as evidence that something has been deliberately hidden or forgotten. Yet absence in the archaeological record does not function like a missing page torn from a book. It functions more like erosion, itself selective, uneven, shaped by circumstance rather than intent. Many texts that once existed no longer survive. Others were never carved in the first place. Recognizing this keeps silence from becoming a substitute for proof. What makes the Sphinx different is not that it lacks documentation, but that it does so within a context where documentation is otherwise abundant. The 4th dynasty left behind a dense textual landscape. Pyramid complexes are covered in inscriptions, naming kings, officials, and cult practices. Quarry marks identify crews and phases of work. Even mundane aspects of construction appear in surviving papyri from nearby sites. Against this pattern, the lack of a clear construction text for the Sphinx stands out. Yet contrast does not equal contradiction. The types of texts that survive tend to cluster around certain functions. Foundation deposits and dedicatory inscriptions appear more often in built monuments than in rock-cut ones. Administrative papyri survive where conditions favored preservation, often away from open-air settings. The Sphinx, carved directly from bedrock and exposed to the elements, occupied neither category. Its creation removed material rather than adding it, leaving little space for texts to be sealed and protected. This structural difference matters. A pyramid encloses chambers, a temple includes walls designed to carry inscriptions, a rock-cut statue offers no obvious place for a foundation text unless one is added deliberately. If such a text ever existed, it would have been exposed to erosion from the outset. Its loss would leave no clear trace. The stone preserves carving, not writing. Even so, the silence invites comparison. Why name the builders of pyramids but not the Sphinx? One possibility is cultural emphasis. The pyramids were royal tombs, central to the afterlife of the king. Their documentation served ritual and political purposes. The Sphinx, while monumental, may have occupied a different symbolic category. If it functioned as a guardian or a divine presence rather than a tomb, its origin may not have required the same kind of textual proclamation. Another possibility lies in the evolution of plans. Large construction programs did not always proceed exactly as envisioned. Decisions were made on site. Designs adapted to terrain. A statue carved from a ridge may have emerged as part of a broader quarrying and building effort, without being treated as a separate project requiring its own record. In such a scenario, the Sphinx could be embedded in activity that was documented elsewhere without being singled out by name. These explanations do not resolve the silence. They contextualize it. They show how absence can arise without implying mystery in the dramatic sense. At the same time, repeated absence across a well-documented landscape does shape probability. Scholars acknowledge this openly. The lack of an Old Kingdom inscription naming the Sphinx's builder does not prove that none existed, but it does remain a notable gap in the corpus. Later texts deepen the pattern rather than breaking it. When inscriptions appear in relation to the Sphinx during the New Kingdom, they do not claim authorship. They speak of restoration, devotion, and divine favor. Kings present themselves as caretakers, not creators. The language emphasizes continuity with an already ancient presence. This framing reinforces the impression that by the time writing returned to the monument, its origins were already beyond reach. The dream stealer of Thutmose IV is emblematic. It tells a story of obligation rather than origin. A prince sleeps in the shadow of the Sphinx's head. The god promises kingship in exchange for clearing the sand. The narrative centers on renewal. It does not explain how the monument came to be. The omission is not accidental. It reflects a worldview in which the Sphinx exists as a given, not as a historical event requiring explanation. This pattern persists in later periods. New Kingdom votive inscriptions address the Sphinx as a deity. Greek and Roman authors mention it in passing, often relying on local tradition. Medieval Arabic writers blend observation with legend. None provide a construction account. Across cultures and centuries, the Sphinx remains present but unexplained. Silence accumulates rather than resolves. Interpreting this silence requires restraint. It is easy to assign it a meaning that fits a preferred narrative. It is harder to accept it as a limit. In scholarly practice, silence is treated cautiously. It cannot be converted directly into evidence for extreme antiquity, nor can it be dismissed entirely. It functions as a constraint, shaping how confident any claim can be. The silence also reminds us that ancient societies did not record everything we might wish they had. Documentation followed priorities that do not always align with modern curiosity. What feels like an omission to us may have felt unnecessary to them. The survival of records is governed as much by chance as by intention. In this way, the absence of a builder's name does not isolate the Sphinx from its context. It places it within a broader pattern of partial knowledge. Many ancient works are known through association rather than explicit testimony. Their histories are reconstructed from material relationships, stylistic comparison, and later references. The Sphinx is unusual only in scale and prominence, not in the nature of the problem it presents. Silence, then, becomes part of the evidence not as a statement, but as a boundary. It tells us where certainty ends. It prevents the leap from plausibility to proof. It keeps the question of age open without letting it drift into fantasy. The Sphinx does not refuse to speak. It speaks in stone and absence alike. Listening requires attention not only to what is present, but to what cannot be recovered. By the time words return to the Sphinx, they do so gently, as if approaching something already venerable. Inscriptions from the New Kingdom do not speak of invention, they speak of inheritance. The monument appears not as a project begun, but as a presence received, something standing before the living, demanding care rather than explanation. This shift in tone is subtle, but it matters. It marks the moment when the Sphinx enters written history not as a creation, but as memory. The titles applied to the Sphinx during this period emphasize divinity and position rather than origin. It is called Horus in the horizon, a solar guardian, a mediator between earth and sky. Such names describe function, not chronology. They place the monument within a religious landscape that had already taken shape. The Sphinx is no longer an object to be built, it is a figure to be addressed. This framing carries practical consequences. When kings of the New Kingdom interacted with the Sphinx, they did so as caretakers. Their inscriptions celebrate acts of clearing, repair, and devotion. They do not claim authorship. The language reinforces continuity with a past that is acknowledged but not defined. In doing so, it subtly distances the monument from any living tradition of construction. The dream stela captures this distance in narrative form. A young prince encounters the Sphinx not as a monument in need of explanation, but as a voice demanding action. The story does not situate the Sphinx in a historical sequence, it situates it in a moral one. Kingship is granted in exchange for restoration. Power flows from the monument to the ruler, not the other way around. This reversal signals age more effectively than any number could. What is striking is how quickly this perspective solidifies. Later New Kingdom inscriptions follow the same pattern. The Sphinx is addressed with reverence. Offerings are made. Statues are placed nearby with prayers for favor. The monument functions as a node in religious practice, not as a subject of historical inquiry. Its past is assumed to be deep enough to justify devotion. This assumption persists beyond Egypt's own dynastic transitions. Greek and Roman visitors encountered the Sphinx as an ancient marvel. Their accounts are brief and often imprecise, filtered through local guides and inherited lore. They describe what they see, not how it came to be. The monument's age is taken for granted, not measured. It belongs to a time before their own histories begin. Medieval Arabic writers continue the pattern. They record legends, speculate about lost knowledge, and weave moral reflections around the monument's endurance. These texts are rich in imagination but poor in chronology. They tell us how the Sphinx was perceived, not when it was carved. By this point, any direct memory of its creation, if it ever existed, had long since dissolved. This long afterlife affects how age is perceived. A monument repeatedly restored can appear both ancient and newly worked in different places. Repairs renew surfaces. Offerings refresh meaning. The Sphinx, patched and maintained across centuries, carries traces of many hands. Its appearance becomes a composite, and that composite feeds the sense of deep antiquity. The past feels layered because it is, yet perception is not proof. The fact that later cultures treated the Sphinx as ancient establishes a minimum age, not an origin. It tells us that by the New Kingdom, the monument already lay beyond living memory. It does not tell us how far beyond. The range remains open, bounded on one side by textual acknowledgement of antiquity, and on the other by archaeological association with earlier building phases. This is where the method-first approach matters again. Texts are powerful, but they have limits. They record what their authors chose to say, shaped by genre, purpose, and belief. Religious inscriptions emphasize continuity and legitimacy. They are not designed to preserve construction histories. Expecting them to do so misreads their function. At the same time, the consistency of the pattern is significant. Across centuries and cultures, the Sphinx is never explained as a recent creation. It is always inherited. That inheritance shapes the conversation without settling it. It adds weight to the idea that the monument's origins lie deep enough to escape documentation, but not so deep that they require extraordinary explanations. The Sphinx's role as a god complicates chronology further. Deities are timeless by nature. Once a monument enters that category, questions of age lose urgency. What matters is presence and power. This shift removes incentives to record beginnings. It also explains why restoration inscriptions dominate the record. Caring for the monument becomes an act of piety, not a historical note. In this way, the New Kingdom does not answer the question of age. It reframes it. The Sphinx becomes something that has always been there, at least within the bounds of cultural memory. That framing influences how later observers interpret the stone. Ancientness becomes a quality rather than a measurement. Recognizing this helps separate two different kinds of age. One is chronological, concerned with years and periods. The other is cultural, concerned with memory and meaning. The Sphinx is unquestionably ancient in the second sense. It was already old enough to be revered when written history approached it. The challenge lies in translating that cultural antiquity into a chronological range without overstepping the evidence. The New Kingdom sources anchor one end of that range. They tell us that by the 2nd millennium BCE, the Sphinx stood as an established presence, buried and revealed, worshipped and repaired. Beyond that anchor, the stone must speak again. And as before, it does so without dates, offering instead the slow accumulation of traces that point backward without ever arriving at a single moment of origin. The moment the Sphinx was fully revealed to modern eyes, it entered a new phase of its life, one defined not by neglect or reverence, but by intervention. For centuries, sand had dictated the monument's rhythm, advancing and retreating according to wind, climate, and human attention. In the 19th and 20th centuries, that rhythm was disrupted. Clearing became systematic, exposure became permanent. What had once been episodic turned into a new baseline, and with it came consequences that continue to shape how the Sphinx is understood. Early modern excavations approached the monument with a mixture of curiosity and urgency. Giovanni Battista Caviglia's work in 1817 cleared sand from around the chest and forepaws, revealing masonry repairs and fragments that hinted at earlier restoration efforts. His notes describe the difficulty of keeping areas clear, as sand returned almost immediately. The work exposed surfaces that had been protected for long periods, but it did so without the benefit of modern stratigraphic control. Deposits were disturbed. Context was lost. Subsequent campaigns followed similar patterns. Each sought to reveal more of the monument, driven by a desire to see it whole. Photographs from the 19th century show incremental change, a cleaner head, a partially freed torso, the body still encased. With each clearance, air reached stone that had not experienced direct exposure in generations. The stone responded quickly. Cracks opened. Surfaces flaked. The rate of decay increased, not because the monument was suddenly older, but because its conditions had changed. The most transformative phase began in the early 20th century under the direction of Emile Barrais. Between 1925 and 1936, his team removed vast quantities of sand, uncovering the entire enclosure down to bedrock. For the first time in centuries, the Sphinx stood fully exposed. The moment was visually dramatic. It was also materially disruptive. Lower surfaces that had been shielded from wind abrasion now faced it directly. Temperature fluctuations intensified. Moisture dynamics shifted. Conservation efforts followed exposure. Blocks were added to stabilize weakened areas. Mortars were applied to fill cracks and cavities. At the time, cement-based materials were considered strong and durable. Their chemical incompatibility with limestone was not yet fully understood. These mortars trapped moisture and salts against the original stone, accelerating decay in adjacent areas. Over time, the repairs themselves became sources of damage. Later conservation campaigns recognized these problems and sought to correct them. Cement mortars were removed where possible and replaced with more compatible materials. Drainage channels were cut into the enclosure floor to divert water during rare storms. Protective measures were added and revised. Each intervention aimed to preserve what remained, but each also altered the surface further. The monument became a composite not only of ancient phases, but of modern decisions. This history matters because many interpretations of the Sphinx's weathering are based on observations made after these interventions. When researchers describe rounded profiles or deep recesses, they are often looking at surfaces that have experienced accelerated decay since exposure. Photographic archives show how quickly change can occur once sand is removed. Comparing images across decades reveals losses that would otherwise be attributed to much longer spans. The modern visitor encounters a monument shaped by this layered history. The chest and forepaws are largely reconstructed. Boundaries between original stone and repair blocks are visible as straight joints and changes in color. Some areas appear smoother than others, not because they are younger, but because they were replaced or reworked. Without accounting for these factors, it is easy to misread the surface. This misreading has implications for debates about age. Features interpreted as ancient erosion may in fact be the result of modern exposure combined with incompatible repairs. Conversely, areas that appear well preserved may owe their condition to long burial rather than recent carving. The surface no longer corresponds directly to duration. It corresponds to intervention history. Modern technology has improved documentation, but it cannot reverse these changes. Laser scanning and photogrammetry capture current geometry with millimeter precision. Satellite imagery reveals patterns across the plateau. These tools allow comparison and monitoring. They show where deterioration is active and where it has stabilized. What they cannot do is reconstruct the exact state of the stone before exposure. That information was lost with the sand. Recognizing this loss is not an admission of failure. It is an acknowledgement of constraint. Conservation records themselves form a documentary layer, recording decisions, materials, and outcomes. They show how interpretations shifted as understanding improved. Early confidence gave way to caution. Visibility was no longer equated with preservation. In some cases, partial reburial was considered as a protective measure, reversing earlier assumptions. This shift underscores a broader point. Human actions are not external to the Sphinx's history. They are part of it. Clearing and repair did not simply reveal the monument, they altered it. Each shovel of sand removed changed airflow and moisture patterns. Each block added changed stress distribution. The present form is inseparable from these acts. This inseparability complicates any attempt to read age directly from the stone. It demands a method that integrates conservation history with geological and archaeological observation. Without that integration, conclusions risk attributing modern damage to ancient time. The Sphinx becomes a mirror reflecting the assumptions brought to it. The paradox is that the desire to know more has sometimes reduced what can be known. By exposing the monument fully, modern interventions eliminated the protective conditions that had preserved certain surfaces. The very act of revelation erased part of the record. What remains is valuable, but incomplete. This does not invalidate earlier observations. It contextualizes them. Statements about erosion made in the decades following clearance must be weighed against the rapid changes that followed. Observations made before clearance describe a different state. Reconciling these requires attention to timing, not just form. The Sphinx's modern history therefore becomes a lesson in humility. It shows how easily evidence can be altered by the act of study itself. It reminds us that monuments are not static repositories of information waiting to be decoded. They are dynamic systems that respond to every interaction. In this light, debates about age must include modern hands, alongside ancient ones. The stone records not only carving and weathering, but excavation and repair. Each phase leaves traces that overlap and obscure. Understanding this overlap does not resolve the question of when the Sphinx was carved. It defines the limits within which that question can be pursued. The monument stands today as both artifact and archive, shaped as much by 20th century decisions as by ancient ones. Any reading of its surface that ignores this history risks mistaking recent scars for ancient ones. The Sphinx survives, but it does so altered. Its silence compounded by the echoes of those who sought to make it speak more clearly. When the question of the Sphinx's age narrows, it often narrows to a disagreement not about stone, but about time itself. Different disciplines carry different clocks. Geology measures duration through process. Archaeology measures sequence through context. Each clock is precise within its own system, yet neither can simply replace the other. Where they overlap, tension emerges not because one is wrong, but because they count time in fundamentally different ways. Geology begins with materials. It asks how limestone responds to environment, how quickly surfaces change under known conditions, how patterns of erosion compare across similar settings. Its strength lies in process. Given certain assumptions about exposure and climate, it can describe what kinds of changes are plausible. What it cannot do is identify cultural moments. It cannot say who carved a statue or why. Its clock runs continuously, indifferent to dynasties. Archaeology, by contrast, begins with relationships. It asks which structures cut into which surfaces, which materials are reused, how buildings align within a landscape shaped by human intention. Its strength lies in association. If one feature supplies stone for another, it must predate it. If a causeway skirts an enclosure, planning is implied. Archaeology's clock ticks in sequences rather than rates. It orders events without measuring their duration. When these clocks are brought to the Sphinx, they do not synchronize neatly. Geological observations of weathered surfaces suggest long exposure histories. Archaeological associations place the monument within a landscape transformed during the Old Kingdom. The apparent conflict arises when one clock is asked to answer the other's questions. When geology is pressed to produce a date, it must assume exposure histories that archaeology cannot confirm. When archaeology is asked to dismiss geological complexity, it risks oversimplifying material processes. This is why debates often hinge on weighting rather than data. One interpretation may prioritize surface morphology, treating erosion as the dominant indicator of age. Another may prioritize architectural context, treating association as decisive. Both approaches rely on assumptions. The disagreement lies in which assumptions are considered safer. The method-first perspective insists that assumptions be stated openly. If erosion is used to argue for greater antiquity, then exposure duration must be specified. Was the surface continuously exposed? Was it buried? For how long? Under what climate? Each unanswered question weakens the inference. If architectural context is used to argue for contemporaneity, then planning coherence and material reuse must be demonstrated without circular reasoning. Each discipline constrains the other. This mutual constraint is not a flaw. It is how responsible interpretation works. When disciplines disagree, the overlap between them becomes the zone of highest confidence. At Giza, that overlap supports a broad placement of the Sphinx within the Old Kingdom landscape, while acknowledging that geological processes have left complex traces that cannot be reduced to a simple timeline. The temptation to resolve this tension by choosing one clock over the other is strong. It promises clarity, yet clarity achieved by exclusion is fragile. The more durable approach accepts that different clocks answer different questions. Geology tells us what stone can do. Archaeology tells us what people likely did. Neither alone can fix a moment of origin. This realization reshapes the debate about being older. Older than what? Older in geological terms means nothing in this context. Older in cultural terms depends on memory and record. Older in archaeological terms means earlier in a sequence of human activity. When claims move between these meanings without definition, confusion follows. The Sphinx exposes this slippage. A claim that it is thousands of years older may be true in a geological sense. Its stone certainly is but irrelevant to carving. In a cultural sense, it was already ancient by the New Kingdom, but that establishes only a minimum age. In an archaeological sense, it sits within a 4th dynasty landscape, suggesting a probable window rather than an exact date. Each sense of older carries a different scale. Recognizing scale prevents exaggeration. It allows geological insights to inform archaeological interpretation without overwhelming it. It allows archaeological context to guide expectations without denying material complexity. The result is not a compromise, but a synthesis bounded by method. This synthesis also clarifies why the debate persists. It persists because no single clock dominates. The evidence does not converge on a precise year. It converges on a range. Within that range, probabilities can be discussed, but certainty remains out of reach. The Sphinx sits at the boundary of what these methods can resolve. In practice, this means that extreme claims, whether of absolute certainty within a narrow date or of radically earlier origins, face the same obstacle. Both exceed what the combined clocks can support. The responsible position lies between them, acknowledging both the strength of architectural association and the complexity of surface processes. The Sphinx does not demand allegiance to one discipline over another. It demands translation. Each clock must be read in its own units, then compared carefully. When that translation is done, the monument's age emerges not as a single figure, but as a constrained interval shaped by material, context, and memory. This interval may feel unsatisfying to those seeking closure, yet it reflects the nature of the evidence honestly. Stone and context agree on some things and diverge on others. Their agreement defines what can be said with confidence. Their divergence defines where inquiry remains open. In this sense, the Sphinx becomes less a riddle to be solved than a lesson in method. It shows how knowledge is built at the edges of different ways of knowing. It reminds us that disagreement does not imply error, only limits. Within those limits, Understanding deepens not by forcing a conclusion, but by respecting the clocks that measure time differently, yet together define the past we can responsibly describe. The closer we move toward an ending, the more the question itself begins to soften. How old is the Sphinx? Sounds precise, almost numerical, as if the monument were waiting to yield a single answer once the correct method is applied. Yet everything encountered along the way resists that expectation. The stone offers process, not timestamps. The architecture offers context, not authorship. The texts offer reverence, not origin. What emerges instead is a different way of understanding age one that unfolds as a span rather than a point. Within scholarly practice, this is not unusual. Many ancient structures lack a moment of birth that can be isolated and dated. They are placed within ranges defined by what must have come before and what is known to have come after. The Sphinx fits squarely within this pattern. Architectural association anchors it within a landscape transformed intensively during the 4th dynasty. Textual evidence establishes that it was already ancient by the New Kingdom. Geological processes describe how its surfaces could have changed under variable conditions across long periods. Together, these constraints form a corridor of time rather than a doorway marked by a year. This corridor is not empty, it is structured. It rules out certain claims while leaving others open. It does not support the idea that the Sphinx belongs to an unknown civilization requiring lost technologies. The stone itself records tool marks consistent with methods known from ancient Egypt. It does not support uninterrupted exposure under a single wet climate regime. Burial cycles are documented and materially evident. At the same time, the corridor does not collapse into a narrow point. The absence of a construction inscription remains real. The complexity of surface change remains unresolved in detail. Understanding age as a range changes the emotional tone of the mystery. It removes the urgency to push the monument either firmly inside or dramatically outside familiar history. The Sphinx does not need to be impossibly old to be profound. Its endurance alone is enough. Carved from the plateau, altered by wind and water, buried and revealed, repaired and reimagined, it carries the weight of time without announcing its beginning. This perspective also reframes why the question persists. It persists not because evidence is hidden, but because evidence is layered. Each layer answers a different question. When those questions are collapsed into one, dissatisfaction follows. When they are allowed to remain distinct, the picture becomes clearer, even if it remains incomplete. And so the Sphinx stands, facing the horizon as it always has, not marking a moment, but witnessing passage. Its age is not a number waiting to be uncovered. It is a relationship between stone and environment, between human ambition and natural process, between memory and loss. Time here does not end in an answer. It stretches quietly, into a range that invites reflection rather than resolution. As the light shifts across the plateau and the long shadow settles again, the monument returns to what it has always been, a presence that endures without explanation. The question fades, not because it has been solved, but because it has been reframed. Age becomes something felt rather than fixed. And in that stillness, the Sphinx remains, allowing time to pass without asking us to count it.